ぎ。I want to continue with my talk on the Gyoji chapter. Gyoji の話の続きをしたいと思います。岩波文庫では376ページの2行目からです。Chōkei Eryō お書。水野八子さんは凛と振り仮名を、打ってます。おそらくエリョという読み方は一般的のようです。長慶のエリョお書は説法家の尊粛なり、説法と原者とに従来して参学する近29年なり、その年月に布団20枚を座破す。今の人の座禅を愛するあるは、長慶を挙げて母校の消直とす。人は多し、及ぶ少なし。しかあるに30年の工夫むなしからず。ある時、両連を喚起せし地並みに骨念として大誤す。30来年かつて郷土に帰らず、親族に向かわず、上下剣と談笑せず、戦逸に工夫す。死の行事は30年なり。擬態を擬態とせること30年。差し置かざる力と言うべし。大根と言うべし。霊視の堅固なる。伝聞するは枠重教官なり。願うべきを願い、恥ずべきを恥とせん。長慶に相付すべきなり。実を論ずればただ同心なく、創業つたなきによりていたずらに妙理には下爆せらるるなり。まずここまでです。長期のエリョお書、という人についてです。まず一番最初に確認のため、今まで何回も言ってきたことですけれども、この行事の末期を道元禅師が、越前の永平寺に移るちょっと前に、書いた巻です。で、その頃の道元禅師といえば、28歳の時に中国から日本に帰ってきて、自分の疑問が一応解決した。自分の、一生の大事がここに終わりんという言葉が確かにあったと思いますけれども、自分の一生の大問題が解決されて、で、もうそれは自分だけのものにするのはもったいないから、ぜひ国に帰って都で多くの人と交流を持って、それを伝えたい。また弟子も育てたい。最初は建仁寺に戻ったけれども、どうも師匠の妙禅禅師が、住職をしていた建仁寺では長くいられなくて、深草、京都のちょっと南に庵を構えて、そしてやがて宇治の高尚寺が建つわけです。つまり騒動ができたんですね。 初めて、道元禅師が夢見た禅修行ができるような騒動ができたわけですが、この行事の巻を書き出した頃には、おそらくもうじき都を離れなければいけない。もう越前に移るか移らないか、そういう話が出てた頃です。で、道元禅師はおそらく迷いがあったと思います。なぜかといえば、もちろん24歳の年で中国を渡った時は、それこそ命がけで船が沈むかもしれないので、命がけで中国に行くわけですけれども、中国を回ったお寺はみんな大きな寺院だったんですね。最後でお世話になった天童山慶徳寺も当時の大きな寺院で、当時の中国の政府の支援があって運営されるような寺院だったんですね。で、都の建仁寺も、今は臨済宗の一つの本山となってますけれども、当時はまだおそらく天台宗延暦寺の別校のような感じで、要するに、延暦寺を総合大学と例えというならば、そこに新しく禅学科みたいなものができた。ですからおそらく日本の中学校では鎌倉仏教について英才は臨済、道元は僧と、法然は浄土、親鸞は浄土真宗、日蓮は日蓮宗を作ったと言われるけれども、その中で英才禅師と道元禅師以外は一回島流しにあってしまうんですね。で、それはなぜかというと、説いていること自体、つまり念仏とか法華経の題目、それは天台宗にもあった修行方法だったけれども、天台宗と違ってこれだけやればいい、これが唯一の正しい道であると、他のことはやらなくていいという主張ですね。で、天台宗ではあれもこれもやってたけれども、むしろ念仏やるならもうそれ以外はできない。題目となるならばもうそれ以外はできない。法華経以外の経も読まない。で、道元禅師も座禅に対して同じような思いがあったんですね。座禅と並ぶものは何もない。座禅だけすればいい。ですからおそらく島流しこそ合ってないけれども、道元禅師にも法然さん、親鸞さん、日蓮さんと同じような天台宗の圧力があったはずです。だからこそ都を離れなければいけなかったんですね。で、英才禅師だけはずっと都に行ってうまく、よく言えばうまくやってたんですね。なぜうまくできてたかというと、今でこそ臨済宗を日本で成立させた人とされているんですけれども、正式には天台宗に離れてないんですね。結局、天台宗のお坊さんでずっとやってたんですね。天台宗の中の、総合大学の中の禅学校の禅学科の学長さんだけれども、一応天台宗という傘の下 で、道元禅師もおそらくこの行事の巻を書く頃には迷ったと思いますね。ここで、島流しに会うか、越前の山奥で細々とやるのか、あるいは、英才禅師のようにもう少し、上手に天台宗と付き合って、座禅だけが正しいんじゃなくて、いろんな道があって、その中に座禅という道もありますよという、もうちょっと柔らかいアプローチを取ればよかったけれども、結局、ここで特に道元禅師が気合い入れているのはダルマさんの話ですけれども、別にインドを離れる必要もなかったし、中国で皇帝と会ってまで理解されなくて、なんでこのダルマさんが山に入って9年間面壁したのかというと話になるんですね。それはもっぱら一切衆生の再度を考えてのことであるという。そのためにはもうインドの熱帯地をもちろん雨が降るんだろうけど雪が降らないような気候に育ったダルマさんが寒い思いをして弟子がつくかどうかも全く保証されてないのに山奥で長年修行してようやく弟子が見つかったというそういう話を黒いほど、書いているわけですね。でダルマさんの他にも、今回はChōkei Eryōですしいろんな人が引用されてそれを道元禅師が自らの鏡として使っているわけです。で今日はChōkei Eryō禅師です。説法の弟子でですから原者のシビがおそらく彼の兄弟子にあたるわけです。死者の説法や兄弟子の原者に、延べ29年参禅をした。その間、この29年の間は20枚の布団が破れた座破すると。この29年の座禅によって20枚の、布団というのはこの場合は座布のことですね。座布が20枚も破れた。当時の座布どんなもんだったかわからないけれども私の座布も今ボロボロです。もちろん30年前、ちょうど29年前に最初に安泰寺に来たその時使った座布と今の座布違うけれども今の座布道場になってから書いたことはあるかもしれないけれども何回も穴が開いてその都度直したりする。で一つ変わったのは低くなる。いっぱい最初にパンに集めて少しずつ低くなっている。でもそれは私は長い間自分にはちょうどいい。若い頃には高い方が良かったけれども年数とともに低い方が座りやすいと思うようになった。ところがその穴が次々と開いてしまうから、今の外のやつを何年前、ともみさんが作ってくれた。それは多分 プラスチック製のなんかウールみたいなやつ。これはなかなか破れないけれども、そこからまだパンニャが出てる。まあ10年以上は持っていると思う。その下の座布団は、これはもともと京都の東福寺のために使ってたやつだけれども、東福寺では結局使うことなく、多分同調になってから座布団を使っている。これも今裏も表も穴だらけだけれども、さすがに1年半では破れない座布にしても座布団にしても。だからこの長期営業はどんな座り方をしたのだろうかというのが疑問になっている。よっぽど座禅中に動いたりしたのかあるいはよっぽどその当時の座布と座布団が、破れやすいものだったのか。まあここで道元禅師は、まあいかに彼がもう気合を入れて座禅した証拠だというふうに、このことを取り上げているんですね。29年の間に20個の座布を座り潰した。今の人の座禅を愛するあるは、長径を上げて模倣の消直とする。座禅を志している人なら、大体みんなこのChōkei Eryōを、まあ、彼に憧れている。彼を目標としている。彼に憧れている人は多いけれども、彼に及んでいる。彼と肩の並べるものは少ない。しかあるに30年の工夫むなしからず。彼のこの30年の座禅工夫は決して虚しいことではなかった。で、ここではこの行事の末期にしては珍しく、悟り体験の話が出てくる。ある時、両連、これは夏で使われるすだれですね。このすだれを巻いた時に骨念として大悟す。突然、大いに悟ることがあった。これだけはここに書かれている。他の行事の末期では、いかに仏祖方が、大変な目に遭いながらでも修行を続けたという、そういうことが強調されているけれども、悟り体験についてはあまり言われてない。ここではちらっと言われています。すだれを、片付ける時だったんだろう。一緒にして気づくことがあったらしい。この30年の間。30来年かつて郷土に帰れず、親族に向かわず、上下剣と談笑せず戦日に工夫する。この30年の間は一度も国に帰ったこともない。自分の親戚にも会ってない。右左隣に修行した仲間とすら話すことはなかった。ただ、もっぱら修行に打ち込んでいた。死の行事は30年なり。こうして30年行を保った。擬態を擬態とせること30年。差し置かざる力と言うべし。大根と言うべし。擬態という面白い言葉が出てきます。この30年の間は、決して全く疑問がなかったわけではない。途中で行き詰まるということもあった。この疑問はちゃんと疑問として受け止めて、 行き詰まりは行き詰まりとして真正面から息止めて30年過ごした。そこでは逃げることもなく、ごまかすこともなく、疑問は疑問として、行き詰まりは行き詰まりとして、それと向き合う30年。差し置かざる力と言うべし。これはなかなかないような志であるし、こんな、大根と書いてありますけれども、こんな大きな根気、強い根気を持った人はなかなかいない。霊視の堅固なる伝聞するは枠重教官なり。ここは水野八百子さんの注釈を見ても、さまざまな英訳を見ても、みんなこの枠重教官の解釈の仕方が違う。水野八百子さんは長兄の志の堅固なことを伝聞するのは、教官により真実を学ぶことであるというふうに説明されてますが、私にはちょっとわからない。霊視の堅固なる。要するに、この長兄の志の固さ、伝聞するは枠重教官なり。それを伝聞するのは、水野八百子さんによれば、教官により真実を学ぶことである。私はむしろ、このような志の、このような堅固なる志こそ、仏教を伝える教科の材料となるし、なぜ、要するになぜお経があるかというと、沢木老師がお経は座禅の注釈だというけれども、なぜお経が残されていって今でも読まれるかというと、こういう志を伝えるためこそお経がある。そういうふうに読んでます。水野八百子さんの解釈の仕方がちょっとここではわからない。願うべきを願い、恥ずべきを恥とせん、長兄に相応べきなり。願うべきを願い、恥ずべきを恥とせん。要するに、ちゃんと狙うべきことを狙って、そして反省すべきことを反省する人。内山老師が安泰寺へ残す言葉の中で、一座二行三鎮と言ってますけれども、一座はつまり座禅。それこそ一座というわけですから、そこで並び立つものはないけれども、その中身と言えば、三下と聖願、あるいは聖願と三下と言います。で、三神は天蔵教訓の鬼神、老神、大神と言いますけれども、菩薩としての聖願が座禅の内容でなければいけないけれども、なかなかそれができない。それに見合った毎日の生活を送ってない自分がここにいるわけです。内山老師は一切分の一の自分と一切分の一切の自己という言葉を使うんですけれども、私たちはみんな一切分の一切の自己を生きていながら、この一切分の一に過ぎないこの凡夫も同時にやっている。で、この凡夫が一切分の一切の自己に目覚めて、それに向かって修行するのは聖願。ところが、一切分の一切が今度一切分の一の自分を振り返って、 それができないということに気づく。そこはまた懺悔が、懺悔の心が起こるんですね。この誓願と懺悔に対応するのは、ここでは願うべき願いと恥ずべき恥ですね。こういう誓願と懺悔を実践する人は、長慶にそうをすべきなり、この長慶に出会って、この長慶を自らの鏡と思えばよい。ところが実を論ずれば、ただ同心なく創業、拙きによりていたずらに妙理にはけばくせられるなり。悲しいかな、本音を言えばみんな同心がない、修行も拙いもの、そのために自分のエゴ、自分の妙理、自分の評判、評価など、それだけ気にして、それに束縛されているんだと。こういう話です。ここからしばらく英語で説明したいと思います。Today's part starts with the story of Master Chōkei Eryō, as he's called in the English translation. In the Japanese, he's called Erin. The Nishijima translation starts with 234 in brackets, and on the left side I see 140C. I will first read the Nishijima translation. Master Chōkei Eryō was a venerable patriarch in the order of Seppō. Going back and forth between Seppō and Gensha, he learned in practice for a small matter of 29 years. In those years and months, he sat through 20 round cushions. People today who love Zazen cite Chōkei as an excellent example of an adorable ancient. Many adore him, but few equal him. His 30 years of effort then were not in vain. Once, while he was rolling up a summer reed screen, he suddenly realized the state of great realization. In 30 years, he never returned to his home country, never visited his relatives, and never chatted with those on either side of him. He just directed his effort single-mindedly. The master's maintenance of the practice was for 30 years. For 30 years, he saw his doubts and hesitation as doubts and hesitation. He should be called one of steadfast, sharp makings, and should be called one of great qualities. Tidings of such firmness of resolve are heard sometimes following the sutras. If we desire what we should desire and are ashamed of what we should be ashamed of, then we may be able to meet with Chōkei. Honestly speaking, it is only because people lack the will to the truth and lack skill in regulating their conduct that they remain idly bound by fame and gain. Gensha was the topic of the last part, which I talked about 2 months ago. If I remember right, I think Gensha was a student of Seppō. So Chōkei studied probably first with Seppō and then with his former Dharma brother Gensha for 29 years. And Dogen Zenji takes it as a sign of proof of his commitment to the Zen that he sat through 20 round cushions, through 20 zafus. So actually it's exactly 29 years since I came to Antaiji, and I sat through a couple, but less than a dozen, far less than a dozen. But the one that I'm using now, I've been using for at least 10 years or so, I would say. It's not in the best shape, but still, I'm wondering how Seppō managed, not Seppō, but Chōkei managed to sit through 20. Maybe he was moving a lot during the Zen. Because if you sit still, there's not much stress on the cushion, or maybe the cushions at the time were not the highest quality. But again, here this episode is used as proof that Chōkei was really serious about his Zazen practice. He said more than everyone else. So people today who love Zazen cite Chōkei as an excellent example of an adorable ancient. Many adore him, but few equal him. His 30 years of effort then were not in vain. Once, while he was rolling up a summer read screen, he suddenly realized the state of great realization. That's kind of not a funny sentence, but kind of in the Gyoji chapter, Dogen rarely mentions the enlightenment experience of the patriarchs. That's kind of one characteristic of this chapter, that he talks at length of the hardships that the ancient ancestors went through. But he rarely talks about the enlightenment experiences. Which probably also has to do with the time when he wrote this chapter. He had already solved his great doubt when he came back from China at age 28. And he had established his own monastery a couple of years later, south of Kyoto. But then around the age of 40, probably the topic came up of moving to the mountains of Echizen, today's Fukui, and build Eiheiji there. And I could imagine that both Dogen Zenji himself and the people around them were not quite sure if that would be the right thing to do. There were so many people more that they could reach in the capital than going to the mountains. And life in the city would be much easier than in the mountains. They didn't know what was waiting there for them. Dogen Zenji risked his life when he traveled to China, but the temples that he visited in China were all big temples that had support from the Chinese state at the time. He didn't really know what it would be to build a temple there from scratch in the mountains. And well, there's a lot of talk about snow and cold in this chapter, but I mean, it gets cold in Kyoto in the winter, but there's not really lots of snow there. And the places in China that he visited, I think he didn't really have so much there in the snow or cold to endure. But then Fukui is a different thing. It's kind of it's a similar climate to here. There's lots of rain, lots of snow. It's deep in the mountains, not so much sun. So he reminded himself of Bodhidharma and all the others that could have had an easier life, but for the sake of practice and for the sake of transmitting this way, went to the mountains and endured these hardships. But then there was also this event here that during this 30 years, once when Chōkei was rolling up a summer read, he suddenly realized the state of great realization. So they have a double realize here, realization. The Japanese is basically daigo, big. He had a big satori. And you probably know on the internet, if you want to have a Shobogenzo translation of the different chapters, you can go to a site which is called the Zen site, and they also have this Nishijima translation, and as an alternative they have the Shasta Abbot translation, which is a little bit different. I will read this as well. The venerable monk Chōkei Eryō was a revered senior monk training under Seppō. For 29 years he went back and forth between Seppō and Shibi, exploring the matter through his training with both of them. Matter with a big M. That's one of the characteristics of this translation, that very often they use capital letters for words which for them probably have special importance, in this case the matter. Exploring the matter with a capital M, through his training with both of them. During those months and years, he wore out 20 sitting mats. There are people today who love doing seated meditation and citing Chōkei. They take this beloved ancient one as their model. Those who idolize him are many, those who equal him are few. At the same time, his efforts for 30 years were not in vain. There was a time when he was rolling up a bamboo blind in the doorway of the meditation hall, and suddenly had a great awakening. So they go for great awakening here. Nishijima has realizing, great realization. I will get back to this soon. In 30 years, he never returned to his home country, never visited his relatives, and never chatted with those on either side of him. He just directed his efforts single-mindedly. The master's maintenance of the practice was for 30 years. For 30 years he saw his doubts and hesitation. His doubts and hesitation. He should be called one of steadfast, sharp makings, and should be called one of great qualities. In Japanese, doubts and hesitation is gitai. Gi is doubt and tai means to get stuck. Or that's one of the meanings. So it's not that these 30 years were kind of a straight path, and then there was this big enlightenment experience, and that's the whole story. But for 30 years he saw his doubts and hesitation as doubts and hesitation. One small detail here is Dogen Zenji makes this point that for 30 years he wouldn't return to a home country, never visit relatives, and never chat with those on either side of him. So in Zendo, you have, well, obviously two neighbors left and right. Often you find in books, like in biographies of prominent monks, often you read that after 3 years or 5 years in the monasteries, they didn't even know the name and the face of their neighbors. And that's to emphasize how serious they are about their practice. Here Dogen doesn't go as far as say that he didn't even know who was sitting beside him, but he didn't talk to his neighbors. Whenever I read something like this, especially when people claim that a monk didn't even know who was sitting beside him because he was so serious, or facing the wall, basically, looking at himself, I wonder where, well, their efforts were actually directed, and if that kind of that focus of practice is what we are trying to do here. If that would be kind of productive attitude in Antaiji, where if after a couple of years you still don't really know who's sitting beside you, or well, you have a certain idea who they are, but you never talk to them. except for maybe the minimum amount of talk that's needed to get Samu done. But then after Samu, you return to your room and sit facing the wall. From my point of view, that would be a very narrow focus of practice. And yeah, if you don't even know who's sitting beside you, how are you supposed to help all sentient beings with your practice? And that's the point he makes about Bodhidharma when Dogen Zenji writes about Bodhidharma. That was the reason why he came to China, to save all human beings. Well, if you never ever had a small talk with your fellow practitioners, how are you supposed to save all human beings? Then there's the question, what was this realization of realization, or that big awakening that he had after 30 years? It happened when he rolled up, summer reed screen, it says here in the other translation. It's a bamboo screen, I think. In the case of Dogen Zenji, they say that he had an insight in China when Dogen's teachers admonished his neighbor who was sleeping. Shinjin Datsuraku, he supposedly said at the time, and Dogen Zenji dropped off body and mind. There's other episodes like this. At one time, supposedly the Buddha held up a flower, and Mahakashapa, his student, started to smile. And that's how the way was transmitted. Somebody had a realization when they saw peach flowers in the spring. Another cleaned the pathway in front of their huts, and a stone flew and it hit bamboo. They heard that sound, and the person had a realization. Then there's the story of Gensha. His teacher held up a finger, and Gensha had a realization, and he would use that for the rest of his life. Whenever people asked him a question, his answer would be this. And then he had a student who imitated that. And although Gensha didn't invent that, Gensha basically copied his master. When his student copied him, he didn't think that was good, and he called the student to him, and when I think he asked him a question, the student raised his finger, he cut off the finger. And at that point, the student didn't have an awakening, but the student ran out of the door crying, and Gensha called him back. And when the student looked back, Gensha raised his finger, and then obviously there was some realization. There's also the story of, what was his name? Was it Toksan? I'm not quite sure of the name of the guy. He had to talk until late at night with his teacher, and the teacher said, well, it's already late, you should go to sleep. And reluctantly the student leaves the hut, but it's dark outside, so his teacher gives him a candle. Here it's dark, take that candle. And the moment the teacher takes the candle, the teacher blows out the candle, and it's completely dark again, and the student has a realization. And I think it was Ummon, but I'm not quite sure if he was in the student's position or the teacher's position. There's a story involving Ummon, and again, the student wants to have a talk, an interview with his teacher, but the teacher, I think, doesn't want to even let him in because he's busy or whatever, he's annoyed. But the student is so persistent that he's trying to close the door by force, try to get in. And Ummon shuts the door so heavily that he breaks the leg of his student. Or maybe I think it was Ummon who shut the door and the student who broke his leg. Another guy left the monastery after a couple of years of practice in desperation and decides to see other teachers, and then he hit his toe on the way down the mountain. Having a realization. So what is happening in that moment? I think it's simply that in those moments, these people return, well, to say it flatly, to the here and now, which is basically where we always are. We're always in the here and now, but we are good at, or at least our attention is pointed somewhere else. We are always in the here and now. We're always in the present. Where else would we be? But the attention is pointed somewhere else. And when we look for the Buddha Dharma, for example, we look for it, well, here and there. We look for it in a book. We look for it in a Dharma talk. We hope to get it in tomorrow's Zazen, maybe, to get a grip or a deeper understanding of the Dharma. And what we forget is what is happening in this moment. And something like strong pain, something that can get somebody back. Because in that moment, there's no room to escape. If it's really a strong, sudden pain, that's something that can get you back. And when you were, until then, in that mode where you were looking here and there, and then right out of a sudden, you pulled back, you can have this realization, oh, what was I looking for? This is me. Everything that's happening in this moment is me. But usually we think, well, here that's me, part of reality, that's me, and over there that's my teacher, and there's those books that are written by wise people. And somewhere around here, I don't see it yet, but somewhere here there must be the answer. But actually, the answer is the space where all of this happens. And a pain can bring you back, or sometimes it can be a flower that's blooming, or in this case, Chōkei, when he rolled up the summer reed, probably at the moment he did nothing but just roll up that summer reed and forgot about everything else, about all those doubts and about this hesitation, and realized I was always in that thing that I was looking for. But then I think it's interesting that Dogen Zenji says, for 30 years he saw his doubts and hesitation as doubts and hesitation. So probably everybody here as well has doubts and hesitation. Sometimes you get stuck. You wonder if this is really the right place for you. If you're not wasting your time, like on the whole page it says minimum 3 years, but 3 years is a long time. Is it really worth 3 years of my life to be here? It would be strange if somebody here says, I never had these doubts. Usually you ask yourself regularly, what am I doing here? Maybe I'm wasting my time. Maybe I should go somewhere else. And what do you do when you have these doubts, or when you think that you get stuck in your practice? You can, for example, you can try to pretend to yourself that you don't really have these doubts. pretend that everything's fine. You can think about all the alternatives and try to convince yourself that the alternatives would be even worse to what you're living right now. Okay, there's this other teacher, there's this other monastery, there's this other possibility, but actually none of them are perfect, so I'd rather stay here for the moment. And well, Chōkei for 30 years saw his doubts and hesitation as doubts and hesitation. So he didn't try to somehow fool himself about the fact that he had these doubts and that he hesitated. He took them at face value. When he was in doubt, he was thoroughly in doubt. When he got stuck, he thoroughly got stuck in his practice. And that's why Dogen Zenji said he should be called one of steadfast, sharp makings, someone of great qualities. Yesterday we had this talk about sleeping in Zazen. And often I'm asked what you can do when you feel sleepy during Zazen. And I still haven't found a good answer yet. One thing to try is what I also said yesterday, rather than have this deep abdominal breath, why not actually make a point of breathing with the breath and breathe in deep and then breathe out deep, which is not the usual way of breathing. Abdominal pain, when you just breathe out, you allow the breath to go out. And it's a long, deep breathing out. Usually that helps you to relax. But when you sleep, often it's because you're so relaxed that your body falls asleep. So when you move the attention upward, or another way of breathing is what they do in Goenka retreats. For the first 3 days they tell you to watch how the breath touches the triangle above the upper lip. So thus you concentrate on the nose while you breathe, neither on abdominal breath nor on the breast breath, but your concentration is in this area. It's basically the actual breath that is going through your nose and touching that triangle. That's also something, because you're moving your consciousness upward, that might help you to stay awake. Keizan Zenji says in a text called Zazen Yojinku, when you feel sleepy, move your consciousness upward, put it on the head, tip of your head, or put it on the tip of the nose. And when you have too many thoughts and you start to get nervous or tense, then you should move your consciousness downwards, have it in the tanden area below the navel, or put it on your feet. So you can experiment like with this, like with drugs. People talk about downers and uppers, I think. So that there's drugs that make you more awake, but then of course less relaxed, and then there's drugs that calm you down and make you more relaxed, but that's not the drug you want to take if you have some work to do, for example. You're so relaxed that you can't concentrate anymore. And in Zazen as well, I mean, there's the state where you're more kind of in a downer state. You're relaxed, but maybe less sharp and more prone to sleep. Or there's this state where you're sharp, but then you have more thoughts. So if you tend to sleep, you might want to try to, well, get a little bit more sharp. And one thing we were talking about yesterday was, well, John said, or Hosen now said, if he's thinking a lot, he's less likely to sleep. So I said, well, why do you think? Why don't you think then? Think about, well, Japanese kanjis or whatever. And Hosen said correctly, well, Zazen isn't about thinking. So it's often said that we're supposed to let thoughts go during Zazen, which is right. Although then when you're actually sitting there with the thoughts, it's not so easy to let them go. How do you let a thought go? Well, one thing that is not so difficult and that has been practiced for a long time in the history of Buddhism is you return to the breath. So you get a thought, you realize I'm thinking, and in that moment where you realize that, you don't have to have a, how do you say, second thoughts about that. Oh, shit, I shouldn't have been thinking. I'm not supposed to be thinking there. The moment you realize you're thinking, you return to breathing. You realize how you're breathing out, how you're breathing in. Or you can return to the posture. You return to the posture. It's likely that during that process of thinking, also your posture changed to a certain degree. Often the thumbs, for example, they move when you start to think. You can return to the posture. Or one thing is return to the sounds. Right now, when we start to sit at 4 o'clock, usually it's completely still in the hondo, except for, well, somebody sleeping, for example, or making noises while breathing. But usually at 4, it's completely silent. But at 6, a lot of insects and birds make sounds. And they start at one point after 4:30, before 5 o'clock, usually they start. But often it happens that you're sitting zazen and in the beginning it was quiet, but then the next thing you realize, oh, there's quite a lot of birds. So what happened in between? Well, often you don't know because your mind was somewhere else. But that's also something that can help you to, well, stay in the moment, awake, and let go of thoughts when you try to be completely with the sounds. Or in the evening is the other way around. At 6, there's quite a lot of concerts still going on in sounds, but at 8, it's completely quiet. And again, it can happen that 7:45 or so you realize, oh, now it's really quiet. When did the birds stop to sing? And maybe the next day to try to actually be there when they stop to sing. Your mind being there when they actually stop to sing. So another thing, when you realize I'm thinking, another thing where you can return to is to the sounds. And we were talking about, well, thinking. Thoughts can also sometimes help us stay awake. Or here, Dogen speaks about doubts and hesitation, or you get stuck in your practice. Also, doubt is something that can keep you awake. But as Hosen said, we're not supposed to think during Zazen, or we're supposed to let these thoughts go. I wouldn't recommend this practice to beginners, but I mean, you sit here for 1,800 hours a year, and after a while you get a little bit more stability. So what you can also work with, just the same as you can monitor the sounds during 2 hours of Zazen and try to be with the sounds. You won't be 100% successful for 2 hours. You will always somehow get off for a while, but then you can return. You get better at it. And after a while, you have a kind of overview of what actually happens during these 2 hours, sound-wise. You have an overview and you know in the morning when they started to sing and which birds there were. You don't have to name all these birds or whatever, but you get an overview of that. And you can, although it's much more difficult, you can do that with the thoughts as well. So when you start to think, rather than let go of the thoughts by moving your mind to something more simple, for example, to the breath or to the sounds or to the physical posture, you can stay with the thoughts and observe what happens. Just like birds, a thought usually continues for a while, it changes, but then it disappears. And then there's another thought, and another thought, and another thought. But they all disappear after a while. But again, this is really super difficult. You might have realized that with insects and the sounds that birds make, it's kind of easy to just watch them as they are without getting caught up in those birds. Or actually, I never met anybody who came to Antaiji and complained that he couldn't concentrate on Zazen because the birds make so much noise. Nobody complains about the sound of birds. But normally we would have a session starting tomorrow for 5 days. And the May session can be one of the most noisy sessions in Antaiji because it's the holiday season. And this is one of the few seasons where we actually often have visitors, or there's people buzzing around the Hondo sometimes looking for wild vegetables, stuff like that, visitors that make a lot of noise. And especially if you speak Japanese. If you don't speak Japanese, it's not so much of a disturbance because it's just noises, but without a meaning. If you speak Japanese, then you start to get annoyed by it because you understand the words and you get caught up by what they say, which is usually nothing important, but you're annoyed that here I'm sitting Zazen and now they talk about the wild vegetables and this and this and this. So although these people just make noises the same way that birds make noises, when you understand the meaning, the tendency is that you kind of are carried away by the meaning. And it makes it almost impossible to just see it as sounds. And even more difficult it becomes with your own thoughts, because these always also have meanings, and the things you think, these are my thoughts, and you either think, well, I have to follow that thought, or the thought invites you to follow it, or you think, well, I must not follow this thought, I have to somehow let it go, or I have to suppress it, or I have to change it into something more positive or whatever. But it's not impossible, but it's a very difficult practice. But if you take it serious, it's also something that might help you to stay awake. That when you start to think and you realize I'm thinking, you can either try to let these thoughts go and return to something else, breath, posture, sounds, or you can stay with the thoughts without allowing them to take you away, but you still see them and you observe them and see how they change and disappear, and then new thoughts appear. Well, you can try it and you will realize how difficult it is, but it's not impossible. If you think it's too soon, then try something else. Like stay with the breath, stay with the posture, stay with the sounds. ここで昨日の話をしました。ホーセンさんは、そのよく眠る と言って、ところが考え事をしているときはあまり眠らないと。だったらじゃあ考え事をすればいいじゃないかと私が言ったら、でも座禅は考えることじゃないでしょうと彼が言って、その通りだけれども、よく、座禅宗は考えを手放すべきと言われている。で、そのためにどうしたらいいかというと、簡単な方法は呼吸を見るという方法があります。自分の姿勢に変える。考え事をしていると多くの場合は姿勢がちょっと変わっていると、例えば親指がちょっとずれたりとかすることがよくあるから、姿勢に変えてこの姿勢を整え直すと考えがおのずと手放される。あるいは音の世界に注意を向ける。この時期だと4時はまだ完全に、静か。音は頭に居眠りする人の音が聞こえるけれども、朝4時はほとんど音聞こえないけれども、6時は多くの虫たち、鳥たちが鳴いている。いつから鳴き出す？ひょっとすると気がついたらもう鳴いているという座禅がある。つまり鳴き出した時に自分の心はちょっと別のところに行ってた。本当に自分は今この五感を済ましていれば、泣き出した時に気づいているはずで、次のやつが泣き出したりで、最初に泣いてたやつはまた病んだり、別のやつが泣き出す。夜はその逆。6時座ったらまだ多くの鳥たちが鳴いているけれども、8時には静かになった。いつから泣き止んだか。自分の心が音の世界と共にあれば気づくはずだけれども、私たちの心があっちに行ったりこっち行ったり、この音の世界にすら気づかないことが多い。で、考えに関しては手放すと言われているけれども、実はこの考えも同じように手放さないで音のようにただ見るという、非常に難しい修行、座禅があっていいと思いますね。難しいのはなぜかというと、考えの場合は自分は見ているつもりでも気がついたら考えの中に自分が飛び込んでこの考えに連れて行かれることがほとんど。呼吸を見ている時ですら呼吸を見ているつもりで考え事してしまっているということが多いから、最初からこの考えを対象にして座っていると、気がついたら自分は考えを見ているんじゃなくて連れて行かれているということがほとんどだけれども、こういうこともできないことはないし、ましてや居眠りしそうな時は考え事していると眠らないというんだったら、じゃあこの考え事をするんじゃなくて、この考えがいかに起こった後どうなっているか、コロコロ変わっていつの間にまた消える。鳥の声と同じように起こっては消える、起こっては消える。その中に自分が飛び込むんじゃなくて、その考えに連れて行かれるんではなくて、今ここという安定したところにおいてそれを見守るという、そういう座禅もある。ただ難しいのは難しい。もう一つ、ちょっと気になったのは、この人は右と左の人と30年間談笑しなかったと言われている。たまには3年経っても5年経ってもまだ隣の単の人の顔すら知らなかったという人の話を聞く。さまざまの偉いお坊さんの伝記でそういうのを読んだことがある。もうそれだけ熱心に壁に向かって座って自分と向き合ったから、隣に誰が座っているかその名前も顔も知らない。 それをどう考えたらいいか、また安泰にそういう人がいれば、逆にやりづらい周りの人にとって、総理にとっても、そういう人が中にいると逆にやりづらい。なんでやりづらいかというと、その壁を見ることだけが自分を見ることじゃない、その隣に誰が座っているか、それも見てもらわないといけないし、隣の人の名前を知らないと、いかにその人の世界が狭いか、でその天地いっぱいの自己だとか、一切分の一切の自己とはなしだけれども、出会うものすべてがそのはずだから、隣に座っている人の顔すら知らなければ何が一切分の一切の自己、何が天地いっぱいだということなわけですから、談笑しなかった。座禅、これから座禅なのに、いつまでたっても世間話をしなかったということなんでしょうけれども、もしそれが本当にもう隣の人に全く見向きもしないで、自分の世界に入ってしまったんだったらちょっと困る。もう一つ、直接これと関係してないけれども、昔から、天台宗には士官という言葉がある。摩訶士官とか天台小士官。こういうふうに書くのかな。止めるに見る。これはもう要するに道元禅師から古くある。で、死というのは、心を止める、南方仏理、サマタというんですね。で、見る方は、今日本でも流行っているヴィッパサナ。で、この中も参加した人は何人もいると思いますけれども、今、日本でも、例えば京都府にご縁下流のヴィッパサナリトリートに参加できる。参加すると何をするかというと、まず3日間シャマタをする。さっき言ったここの三角に集中する。そうすると心が、集中力が上がって安定してくる。この死の方ですね。で、残り1週間、10日のリトリートから残り1週間はヴィッパサナ、体全体を観察する。これは見る方ですね。で、八正道には、少年と少女という言葉がある。この少年は、マインドフルネス、ヴィッパサナ、正しく念ずる。で、これは英語に訳されると、right mindfulness と訳されてます。で、少女が最後になります。これは7番目で、これが8番目、最後になるんですけれども、これはサマタで、英語では right concentration と訳されている。とか right meditation. What's the eighth of the eightfold path? The last one? こちらが mindfulness. Well, I think I might be wrong, but I mean, also depends on the translator. But often the seventh one is translated as right mindfulness, and the last one right concentration. で、禅宗ではあまり分けないですね。座禅における念と情、二つに分けないのが普通です。あるいは死と観、もう二つには分けない。けれども、あえてこれを分けて考えた場合は、この情というのは集中力。ちゃんと今ここにピンとあって、要するにこの情の反対は ボケている状態ですね。もうボケている人はこの情が足りない。だからスリッパーがちゃんと揃ってないとか、それを注意する。なぜならば見えてない。で、この情力という言葉もあるけれども、情の力、これを高めるのに、ずっと呼吸を見るという方法。あるいは、これはもう今亡くなったけど、須田道紀さんという人は、座禅している人の前に演奏を、掛け軸に書かれて演奏を置いて、その真ん中に一点が書いてあったんですね。その演奏の中の一点を見つめさせたという、他にはあまり聞いたことのない工夫、それを、方便として使ってたらしいんですね。本人から聞くと。方便といって、座禅をする人に一点だけに目を合わせて座禅をさせる。そうすると、上がるのはこの情ですね。ここが情で、サマタ、死ですね。心が安定してくる。ところが、念というのは、内山老師はよくその座禅の風景とか、そういうものを言いますけれども、座禅しているときは、様々なものが起こる。雑念も起こる。体の感覚もあって、それが変わったりする。自分呼吸がそこにある。音の世界がある。で、念というものは、その全体を見渡す。いかに自分の視野を広げられるかということですね。カメラで言えば、情というのは一点だけにピントを当てて、そこがはっきりしてくるけれども、念がないと、それこそ自分の隣に誰が座っているか、それすらわからないような状態。壁の一点だけを見ている。あるいは自分の呼吸だけを見つめている。この簡単念だけに集中して、他の世界は全く見えてない。これは、情があっても念がない状態ですね。念があって情がないと、全体を見ているつもりで、結局全部がボケているという状態ですね。何にも、全部を見ているつもりで、本当は何もちゃんと見えてないという、そういう状態もあるんですね。で、座禅で習っているのは、両方、全体を見渡しているけれども、はっきり見えている。それぞれのものが、それぞれのものとして、はっきり見えている。で、片方だけをやっていると、例えばその居眠りばっかりをやっているとか、考え事ばっかりをやっているというのも、それと関係していると思う。要するに、視野は広げているけれども、全然ピントがどこにも合ってないというと、多分眠ってしまう。いつの間にか。リラックスしてオープンになっているんだけれども、そこからついつい居眠りに入ってしまう。情だと、自分が集中すべきところがあるから、意識は覚めやすいけれども、一点だけだから、それが本当の安定というか、自分の本当のよりどころとなってない。いつも一点だけだけど、そこが不安定になっているというか、 一つのものにとらわれている、呼吸を見たならば呼吸だけに結局とらわれてしまっているという、この昔はこれは分けて行じたけれども、座禅ではどちらも大事だよと、結局つながっているという、つながりの中でこれをやらないとダメだと。だから道元禅師もこういう分け方をしないと思う。So in the Eightfold Path, second to last you have right mindfulness, and then the last would be right concentration. And in the Tendai sect before Dogen Zenji, they had something called Shi Kan, and Shi means to stop and Kan means to view. Shi corresponds to samatha and Kan to vipassana, and vipassana again corresponds to nen or mindfulness, and samatha corresponds to jo or concentration. And in Zen you need both, and usually we don't divide these two, but jo or concentration means that you're really focused, your mind is present. And that's why it's, for example, important that, well, if you take off your shoes, the shoes are right beneath each other because, well, your mind has to be there. So if it would be kind of, as an example, we use a camera and you take a picture, you have to adjust the focus. You want the picture to be sharp. But in Zazen, there's a lot of things happening. In 1 hour of Zazen, there's the sounds, there's the physical perceptions, there's the breath, there's thoughts coming and going. And Uchiyama Roshi often speaks about the landscape of Zazen. So this dimension here is kind of describes the amount of what you see, how wide your focus or how wide your attention is. So in the case of the camera, it would be, well, how much you actually have in the picture, how big your attention is. And in Zen, you want both. Both is important. You want to be aware of the whole reality of what is happening right now, but it shouldn't be blurred. If you have only a wide and open mind, but none of this, then it will be all blurred. And, well, you think you're wide and open, but actually you're only dreaming, and the next moment you're sleeping without being aware of that. If you're always focused and in the here and now, but you don't have this, then you're only focused on what you want to focus. For example, when you take care of the shoes, you do that, but you forget about everything else. Or what often happens when you're the tenzo is you're doing the tempura and you're concentrating on that, and you got the right temperature there, but then you forget that 5 minutes ago you opened the hot water for the ofudo, and because your mind is concentrated, but it's concentrated only on the tempura, and you forget about the ofudo. Of course, when you open the hot water for the ofudo, you can't wait there for 10 minutes and just watch the hot water going in and forget about the tempura, or if the telephone is ringing, you ignore that. So the same with Zen. Sometimes it's helpful if your thoughts go all over the place and your attention is floating all over the place, but in reality is nowhere. You just think you're attentive, but in reality you're nowhere. It can be helpful to return to the breath, but if you do only this, then also your reality is very small. So that's also one reason why I was a little bit kind of thinking or in doubt about this saying that for 30 years he never talked to his neighbors. Because that could lead one to the idea that your true self is somewhere behind that wall that you're facing in the Zen. So you really have to focus on the wall so that finally you get towards the true self that must be somewhere beyond the wall. No, I mean your neighbors are just as good part of the true self as your abdomen or your breath or what you have in the books or whatever, the sounds of the birds. It's just as much as the true self as your neighbors. So, of course, having a communication with your fellow practitioners is also part of the practice. But then, of course, chit-chat is something that can also take you away. That's why we say, of course, you don't talk during Zazen. But then it often happens that people talk a lot during Samu. So what's the difference? If it's okay to talk during Samu about things that are not related to Samu, why don't we talk during Zazen as well? Well, we don't talk during Zazen because we want to be in the moments. When you talk, you're also talking in the moment, but what you're talking about usually takes you away from that present moment. So that's why we keep silent during Zazen, and for the same reason, it's usually worth to keep silent during Samu as well. When you realize, actually, I'm engaging in chit-chat, and I'm not really where my hands are, in the works of my hands. It's a good idea to return to that. But this doesn't mean that we shouldn't even know who we practice with and what these people have in their minds and about their emotions. So we connect during break time and we connect on Hosan with these people. It's not that for 30 years we don't want to have a conversation with anybody. Okay, I thought I would get ahead quicker than I am. Now we come to a different Zen master, and this part is actually a little bit longer than the one with Chōkei. So maybe I'll stop here for today and continue with Isan Zenji next time. 本当はもっと進めると思いましたけれども、続くイサンリュウ禅師の話がもっと長いので、ここで今日終わらして、質問などに答えたいと思います。So as always, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. よろしくお願いします。Yes, please.
In the beginning you said Dogen moved to the mountains for the sake of the true Dharma, something like that. But, well, there's the vow to save all beings, so why would you move away from the capital basically to the mountains where almost no one can reach you? Like how can we interpret that?
Yeah, I talked a little about it in Japanese, but I didn't say that in English. So basically, Dogen Zenji belongs to what is called Kamakura Buddhism, which started around the year 1200. And the people who started it were, Honen and Shinran. They started Pure Land Buddhism. So they preach that you can reach salvation through only through the help of Amitabha Buddha. So you chant Namu Amida Butsu. Then the last of these Kamakura Buddhists was Nichiren, who said you can reach salvation only through the help of the Lotus Sutra. So you chant Namu Myoho Rengekyo. As you all know, Buddhism started with Shakyamuni Buddha. So in all of these schools, Shakyamuni Buddha is important, but for the Nembutsu Buddhists, for the Pure Land Buddhists, Shakyamuni is basically important because he taught the people at his time that there was a Buddha who lived already before him, Amitabha Buddha, who promised to save everyone, even the most evil person who can't practice. So basically for the Pure Land Buddhists, Shakyamuni is important because he informed us about Amitabha Buddha. And for the Nichiren Buddhists, Shakyamuni is important because he taught the Lotus Sutra. So basically for the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni was the tool that the sutra needed to become manifest in this world. So actually for them, if they had to choose between Shakyamuni Buddha and the Lotus Sutra, it would be the Lotus Sutra. That's important. And Shakyamuni was necessary for the Lotus Sutra to manifest in this world. And for Dogen, it's all about Zazen. And Shakyamuni was basically the first who exemplified Zazen through his practice. But it's not that we pray to Shakyamuni, but we learn from the practice. And it's for him, it's only Zazen. And then there was a guy called Eisai. And if you read history books on Kamakura Buddhism, you learn about that in junior high school in Japan. Usually you learn, well, there was Eisai, and he started Rinzai Zen, Dogen started Soto Zen, Honen started Jodo sect, and Shinran started the Jodo Shin sect, and Nichiren started the Nichiren sect. And one thing that most of these guys have in common is, or all of them as far as I know, they started out as Tendai monks. They ordained in Tendai sects, and they studied first as Tendai monks. And the practice that later they taught, they were all part of Tendai practice. So they actually chanted the name of Amitabha also in the Tendai sect. They took refuge in the Hokkekyo, and they also practiced meditation. The difference between the founders of the new sects is that they said you can do only one thing. You have to make a decision for one thing. So if you practice Nembutsu, do only that and forget about the whole rest. Nichiren said, well, you can take refuge only in one sutra, so taking refuge in the Hokkekyo, the Lotus Sutra, because that's the best and only true sutra. And Dogen said, well, if you do Zazen, only do Zazen. In the Bendo-wa, he says you don't even need to prostrate over incense, read the sutras. In the Zuimonki, repetitively, he says, don't read anything, just practice Zazen. So for Dogen Zenji, it was only Zazen and not Zazen plus something. And that's the reason why all of these guys got into difficulties. So Honen and Shinran and Nichiren were banned from the capital. At the time they had what is called in Japanese Shimanagashi. So people were banned to an island. They had to go to an island for a couple of years, or sometimes even a second decade. What they did with Napoleon in the European history at one time, that they sent him to an island. So they wouldn't kill these people for some reason. They could have killed them as well, or some Buddhists were also killed at the time. But with others, they said, okay, we don't kill you, but please go to that island and we don't want you back for a decade or two. And probably Dogen felt that he might have the same destiny if he not either leaves the capital or makes a compromise. And the other person who didn't have to leave the capital was Eisai, who's credited with founding Rinzai Zen. But there's a little bit a problem with this saying that Eisai was the first Rinzai monk, because he never officially left the Tendai sect. It was, or when he founded Kenninji, I think it was still a Tendai temple. So like Tendai was like a university that covered all of Buddhism at the time, and Eisai founded, well, the Zen section of that university, but he didn't say, well, this is the only thing you could do. So it was kind of something that Tendai monks could do if they wanted to meditate. They could come to Kenninji. So Eisai was pretty good at arranging themselves with the Buddhist establishment at the time. And Dogen could have done the same if he wanted to stay in the capital. But he felt, I think, that, well, he couldn't make compromise. He couldn't say that, well, Zazen is just another approach among many. But rather, actually, well, he says, in several spots, I think, that he basically thought he was the first who brought Buddhism to Japan. When Dogen Zenji lived, Buddhism had been in Japan for 500 years, but Dogen Zenji says, well, the sutras have been in Japan for 500 years, but there has been no Buddhism. And the proof for that is, well, there's nobody who dedicated themselves to Zazen 100%. People were doing meditation on the side. But if they had understood that when Shakyamuni sat under the Bodhi tree, that's all what it is about, then people would have done that so far. So Dogen Zenji at age 28 came back to Japan, came to Kyoto and said, there's no Buddhism in Japan yet. I'm the first one to bring it here. And people didn't like to hear that. And of course he could have said in his 30, oh, sorry, I was wrong. I'm just one out of many, and all of you are also practicing. We're all brothers in the Dharma, so let's get along with each other. He could have said that, but, well, we don't know if we would have Soto Zen today, or if it would have been absorbed by Tendai. So you're right, and I think that's also a reason why Dogen was in doubt. Should I go there to the mountains? Will there actually somebody listening to me? In Kyoto, I have much more people that I can reach, and my impact much bigger, but I will either be sent to an island, or I have to make a compromise and water down to my teaching to a degree where I could rather, well, just shut my mouth and become one of these priests with their fancy robes that sits in a rich temple, but I'm not practicing the Dharma anymore. But apart from that, he died at age 53, so he wasn't the most healthy person. Probably, I think he wasn't really the guy for the mountains, and probably he felt that himself. So actually, I might cut down the length of my life when I go there to the mountains, and yeah, who knows if I will find any students. But he thought it would be better than making a compromise and arrange himself with the Buddhist establishment of his time. Hokani arimasen ka? Anything else? Please.
I have a question, but it's not something that sort of came up in your teisho. It's something that came up in my rinko, which I was it's often said that practicing Buddhism is about clarifying the great matter of life and death.
Yes.
How do you sort of perceive that? Because when I sort of thought about it, or at least attempted to think about it in a more sort of understandable way, I sort of couldn't quite pin down some sort of meaning, like what is the great matter of life and death?
Well, for me, it's pretty simple. Like, none of us really knows why we were born, why we are here in this world. And all of us know that we're gonna die, but we also don't know when that's gonna happen, and we don't know what's gonna happen afterwards. So we don't know what came before birth, and we don't know why we were born, we don't know when we die, what's gonna happen after that. And also nobody really knows what to do with the time in between these 70, 80, maybe 90 years that we have. As kids, we're told that, well, first we have to learn to use the toilet and then tie our shoes and ride a bicycle, and then we're sent to school and told to make our homework so that we get good grades. Why that? So that we can get a good job and later earn money, and if we get rich, we might find a beautiful wife and have children and build a big house and drive in a fast car. And why would we want to do that? Well, everybody wants to do that, and then also your children then maybe later will get to good school and also become rich and have beautiful wives, and then you have lots of great grandchildren. But then, I mean, that's the big matter, or that one matter of life and death. When you realize that I will die, and my wife will die, my children will die, and my grandchildren will die, then the question is, of course, why would I want to waste all my energy and time to play that game that everybody is absorbed in? But it seems to be, well, pretty useless when you think about the fact it's going to end. And all these points that you scored during the game, they're all going to be taken away from you anyway. All the money you earned, and all the sex you had, and all the food you ate, and all the cars you drove, you can't take that with you after you die. So for me, the great matter of life and death is the question, well, right now I'm here in the world. I don't know why. And don't know what's gonna happen later. But I have today, and maybe also tomorrow, and then another day, who knows? But what can I make out of today? And sometimes I put it like this. I think I try to explain it like this also in past Dharma talks. So one point of practice is to, well, just stop that game for a while and realize you don't have to be a player in that game. There's no need to get absorbed by the game. So you just, especially during the Zen, for an hour, you just stop the game and you're not this player anymore. You don't try to score any points during the Zen. That's also the reason why we say the Zen is good for nothing. You don't get any points for the Zen. You stop playing the game and just see, well, what's there? What's happening? Without worrying about points, about worrying where you get there as a player, as this one player that you are. Right now you're 1 out of 6 here. But during the Zen, you forget about being 1 out of 6 or whatever. You just, the whole of reality. And then the other half of practice, which is just as important, is that at one point you return to the game. That's why our emphasis is it's actually not good if after 30 years you have never communicated with your neighbors. You don't even know their names. In Mahayana Buddhism, it's essential that you return to the level of the game, but you play with different rules. You try to change the game from inside. So you don't try to escape from the game and say, oh, I don't want to have to do anything with the game, but as I need something to live, please give me some food. So you go to bed in the morning and then you eat that in the afternoon, then you meditate in the evening. But apart from begging and getting the food for the day, you don't want to get involved in the game. In Mahayana Buddhas, you say, yes, let me play with you, but maybe there are different rules with which we play. Who decided that it's all about money and sex and cars and delicious food? And why does each of us only think, I'm this player and I need to get as many points for this guy? Why don't we play together as a team? It's one whole team and there's no other team. I think that's what Mahayana Buddhism is about. But before you try to build this team awareness, first you have to, get a little bit out of the game, because the tendency to get absorbed into the game and to identify with only this one player that we call ourselves is so big that first you get out of that. And Zazen is one way to just stop the game. But then it's also important to get off the cushion again and to connect with people and raise this awareness of, hey, we're playing only a game here, and maybe the game is much more enjoyable if we play with little different rules. That's how I see it. The great matter of life and death. You have maybe even less than 70 years. I mean, you can die in your 30s or 40s, but you have this time on this planet. You don't know why you're here. You don't know what's going to happen afterwards, but you know you're right here. How do you use this time? How do you use this time? You don't want to play the same game that everybody else plays. Otherwise, probably you wouldn't be here. Unless that's what some people do. They think that this search for enlightenment is also just another part of the game. So they try to get the enlightenment and then they can impress the girls when they get back to their home countries. Hey, I got enlightened, got my Dharma transmission in Antaiji. Do you want to be my girlfriend? But probably there are more efficient and faster ways to impress your girlfriend.他にありませんか?
ちょっと質問がうまくまとまってないんですけれど、今の、宝泉さんの質問に対するお答えの中で、出てきたことにちょっと関連してなんですけれど、そうですね、だから座禅をしているときに、座禅をすることによって、今ここにいるという、のを、掴む、とするとですね、冒頭の方のお話の、やはり宝泉さんのお話であったその考えてないと起きていられないっていうことの関係はどうなのかなと思ったんですね。だから座禅をすることによって今ここにいようとしているのに、それを考えることによってそこからさらに話そうという力がその座禅をしている人の中で起きてくるわけですね。そういうことが起きているように解釈できるかなと思うんですけど、その その今にいようと思いながら、今から離れたいっていう、何か違うことを考えていて自分をそれまでの自分を保ちたいっていうの葛藤が起きてるわけですね。それはごめんなさい、葛藤という解釈が正しいのかわからないんですけど、そういう状態について何かこうどんなふうに解釈されますか？
以前も澤田さんとこの居眠りについて話したことありましたよね。その時に澤田さんがその座禅中に寝るのは逃げだというようなことを言ってましたよね。
そうですね、似たようなことを前の話したことありますね。
まあそういう居眠りもあると思いますね。一つの逃げ道として今ここにいたくない心が居眠りとか眠りの中に逃げ込んでしまうというのはあると思いますね。で、まあ安泰寺ではそれは聞いたことがないけれども、禅宗の中にも居眠り座禅は悟りに限りなく近いものだという人がいるんですね。何が近いかというと、眠ろうと思って眠っているんじゃなくて、まあそれこそ無意の働き、もうそこで私というものがない、気がついたら眠っているわけですね。まあその眠れない人はおそらく寝たいと思って布団に寝ているけれども眠れない。でまあいつかは眠れるけれども、それはもう自分の努力の結果として眠ったんじゃなくて、それこそもう手放し、思いの手放しで眠っている。だから眠るのはどこが悟りに近いかというと、その自分ができるものではない。むしろ自分の力を超えておのずと、まあその藤田一生さんで言えばもう自らじゃなくておのずから眠る。ただ要するにそこに自分の意識がないわけですから、そこはまあつまらない。要するに仏教では目覚めることが大事ですから、この私できない働きが今ここに現れている、そこはもう眠りと近いんですけれども、それに気づいている何かが気づいている何かがここにある。この気づきも私が気をつけているから気づいているのじゃなくて、この気づきだって私の気づきではない。何かが気づかせてくれているという。それがまあ、座禅が狙っているものだと思うんですね。今ここに置かれて、そして気づかされている。現実が現れる。誰が気づいているか、それもはっきりしない。何が気づかせてくれているか、それもはっきりしないけれども、気づいているという事実がある。で、澤田さんの質問は、そこに、行こうとするというか、今ここにいようとするのに、じゃあもう一度お願いします。
いや、そうですね。だからここにいようとしているのに、なんでしょうね。要は考えがどうしても浮かんできてしまうっていう、そのいいこう座禅の状態にしたいと思っているのに、いろんな考えが浮かんできていますと。で、よくあるお話は浮かんできたものをどうするかですよね。なんですけど、そうじゃなくて、そもそもその浮かんできてしまうその浮かんでくる勢いはどこから来てるかなと思ったんですね。で浮かんできてる勢いというのは、実はその今ここにいるというふうにしようと思って座禅をしている自分を邪魔しようとしているものがあるんじゃないかなっていう、そうはしたくないというもう一人の自分がいて、本当は座禅をしている自分はそういったものから離れて今に来ようと思っているのに、今に行くべきではないという、その抵抗する気持ちというのがそういうの
起きる。まあ一つはその居眠りかもしれないんですけど、居眠りに流れるものかもしれないんですけど、その考えてからはっきり起きていられるっていう状態もやはりその今いることを邪魔しようというこう、もう一人の自分の働きみたいなものがなんかあるのかなっていうようなことをちょっと話の流れの中でちょっと思いながら聞いていたっていうことなんですけれど、
まあそれは古くからまあカルマという言葉だとか、道元禅師の言葉にも衝動の因縁という言葉が出てくるんです。衝動はその要するにこの道を邪魔する、道を妨げる因縁が古くからあって、いきなり座禅して全部手放そうと思ったって、そこはもう自分のその条件付けられている、自分が座っているポンプとしての自分が座るわけですから、それこそ内山老師の10年10年10年というような長い時間をかけて、で座禅だけ頑張ってするんじゃなくて、生活すべてがそれを中心に整っている。だからまあさっきの八正道でもまあ少年とか少女も大事だけれども、気づきだと集中力も大事だけれども、まあ正しい言葉遣いだとか正しい生活、正しい行い、正しい努力なんで、それが大事かというと、それによって自分のカルマが変わったり、それを、この自分のどうしてもまあ任してしまっている睡魔だとか考えだとか、今ここからよその方へ引っ張ろうというこの力は、やっぱり生活全体、この24時間の生活を整えることによって、そしてもう長年かけてでないと変わらないと思いますね。だってその自分の体の健康だってその1週間2週間でどうにかなるもんじゃなくて、長年食事生活を変えて、睡眠時間を変えて、運動とか始めて、ようやく変わるもので、自分の心もそれ以上多分時間かけないといけない。そうでなければわざわざこういう僧林を作って、その僧林の中でもまあ最低10年やってみろと言われないと思いますね。だからまあ昨日彼にも、じゃあその実際に夜寝てるのは何時かというのも聞いた。そのただ単に睡眠時間が短ければある程度はまあ眠らなければいけないから、いくら気合い入れたって毎日4時間しか寝てなければ、まあ東福寺はそれだった。そうすると体が勝手に好きさえあればいつでも眠れる。だからある程度夜眠らないと当然座禅中に眠ってしまうというのもあるし、あるいはでも過去にあんたにもたくさんあったけれども、夜も眠ってて朝も眠って接心だったら昼も眠って夜も眠ってほとんどいつも眠っているという人もいる。それはおそらくまあカルマというか、その澤田さんが言うその逃げというか、今ここに自分がいるということはあまりにも辛くて、眠った方が楽でそこに心が逃げてしまうという癖がもうついてて、はい、
はい、ありがとうございます。
他にありませんか？まあ明日からはセッションじゃなくてリトリートですけれども、まあ日頃みんなおのおの自分を中心だと思ってなくて、まあ総輪を全体を見渡して行動してくれていると思うけれども、まあ明日からはリトリートの参加者を中心だと思って 動いてもらえたらと思います。So tomorrow we won't have our monthly session but retreat, and you all know that Antaiji is not about you. You're supposed to create Antaiji. You need to create Antaiji, but it's not your personal, individual creation. You have to forget yourself and have the eyes wide open for the whole Sangha. It's not about you, it's about the Sangha. Or that famous John F. Kennedy quote in Antaiji would be it's not about what the Sangha can do for me, but what can I do for the Sangha. And tomorrow, for 5 days, it's going to be about the people who come here. So see what you can do for these 16 people that will spend 5 days here. And yeah, it's different than a session, but probably just as challenging or even more challenging with that amount of people coming and the small group of people being here. But let's do our best and hope that they will have great 5 days. Some of them are only coming only for that purpose to Japan. So hopefully they don't regret that they spent all the money and time to get to Antaiji for 5 days. Shūzhō Seigando Bonno Mujin Seigandan Homon Muyo Seigangaku Butsudo Butsudo Muzo